When I woke up, my phone screen was lit up with 10 missed calls and just as many voicemail notifications. The area code wasn't one I recognized, and after dealing with an endless string of Chinese robocalls, I'd set my phone to send any unfamiliar numbers straight to voicemail. Most of the time, those spam calls didn't bother leaving messages, but this time was different. My daughters were still asleep, so I decided to listen to the voicemails. That's when I found out that Megan, my wife of 7 years, wasn't in Jacksonville, Florida, visiting her parents and sister like she'd told me. Instead, she was in Boulder, Colorado, more specifically in the burn unit of a hospital. For a moment, I just stared at the phone in disbelief, trying to process. A hazy memory tugged at me, something I'd seen earlier that morning. My phone always shoved news notifications at me, which I usually ignored, but one headline had stuck. Something about a fire in Boulder. Curious, I opened my phone and scrolled to the news feed. Sure enough, the top story read, "Freak wildfire consumes suburban Boulder subdivision overnight." Now, I'll admit, I'm not always the quickest to pick up on things, but it didn't take a genius to figure out why Megan had lied about her weekend plans. I forced myself to slow down and think. Rushing headfirst into things wouldn't help. After making a pot of coffee, I sat in the kitchen, staring into the cup, my mind racing. The girls wouldn't be up for at least another hour, so I had some time to figure out my next move. Megan's work nook was in the dining room. I carried my coffee over and found her laptop sitting on the little desk. When I opened it, I discovered she'd recently added a password. I didn't know it, but Megan could be absent-minded and careless when it came to this sort of thing. A quick rummage through the desk drawer turned up a scrap of paper with the password scrawled on it, buried under a mess of pens and sticky notes. Once I logged in, I saw she hadn't even bothered to close her email browser. Just snoozed the laptop, assuming her new password would be enough. Clearly, Megan also counted on me respecting her privacy. Well, as far as I was concerned, any assumptions about trust in our marriage were out the window. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. The truth was sitting there in her emails like a flashing neon sign. She'd been hooking up with Ben Turner, her old college boyfriend. The plan was to spend the weekend with him at his home in Boulder, conveniently timed for when Ben's wife would be out of town. This was the same Ben who'd broken Megan's heart back in the day by falling for another woman, the one he eventually married. But now, it seemed, Ben was having second thoughts about his life choices. The emails didn't dive too deeply into details, just flight confirmations and arrival times. I figured the real conversations happened over the phone. But what really set my blood boiling was what I uncovered next. Megan's parents and sister had been in on it. They'd agreed to cover for her, pretending she was in Jacksonville. That little tidbit wasn't in the emails, but in Facebook Messenger chats she'd left open. Apparently, they'd always thought she should have married Ben instead of me since his family had money. I sat there, numb, like I was watching a car crash in slow motion. My chest felt tight, but I forced myself to take deep breaths. If I didn't, my Apple Watch would start nagging me about mindfulness or whatever. I made a mental note to disable that feature later. Right then, though, I needed those deep breaths to keep myself from putting a fist through the sheetrock. Once I'd calmed down enough to think clearly, I called the hospital in Boulder. The operator asked me to identify my connection to Ben Turner when I inquired about him, so I said I was a friend. She wouldn't confirm anything but wouldn't deny it either. Her vague response strongly hinted that Ben was, in fact, a patient there. Finally, I turned my attention to the number Megan had left in one of her voicemails and dialed it. The number led directly to the hospital admissions office. After I identified myself, a clerk gave me the grim details. Megan had been admitted with third-degree burns covering 80% of her body. On top of that, her lungs had been badly damaged by smoke inhalation. The fire had erupted suddenly in the drought-stricken area, whipped into a frenzy by high winds. It spread so fast it cut off the only escape route from the neighborhood. Over 100 homes had been reduced to ashes. "Sorry, but you must have the wrong person," I said, my voice steady but cold. "My wife is in Jacksonville, Florida." Without waiting for a reply, I hung up. But deep down, I knew the truth. She was in Boulder. My gut told me so, even though I wasn't ready to admit it out loud. I wasn't about to make this easy on anyone. I turned back to Megan's laptop. Opening Ben Turner's Facebook page was a breeze. Megan had actually friended him, making it almost too simple to dig deeper. From there, it didn't take long to figure out who Ben's family and close friends were. His wife, Rachel, had posted publicly from her family's home in San Diego. She was asking for prayers, saying her husband was in a Boulder hospital with severe burns. Time to get those prayers answered by a God of vengeance. I thought, my jaw tightening. I sent Rachel a message on Facebook Messenger, introducing myself and laying out everything I'd pieced together. I included my phone number, waiting to see if she'd respond. Not long after, as I finished my now cold coffee, my phone lit up with another missed call. The number wasn't familiar, but there was a voicemail. It was from Rachel Turner. I called her back immediately. "Miss Turner," I asked when she answered. "Is your first name really Rachel?" She sighed. "Yes. Believe me, I knew what I was getting into when I married Ben. It's just an icebreaker now. I did it for love." Her voice was weary but polite. "You're Megan's husband, right?" "That's right," I replied. "So, you knew about her when you and Ben got together?" "Of course," she said. "He was acting odd lately, but I couldn't figure out why. Now it all makes sense." "Is that your story too?" "Kind of," I admitted. I knew about Ben from her past, but Megan wasn't acting any different. At least not that I noticed. "You're handling this pretty calmly," she said, sounding surprised. "How are you managing that?" "My damn phone keeps nudging me to breathe deeply and practice mindfulness," I replied dryly. "I don't even want to know what it thinks about my heart rate." Rachel gave a tired chuckle. "You actually sound calmer than I feel," I said, curious. "I'm not as composed as I sound," she admitted. "I'm on some pills my sister gave me. Honestly, I don't even know what they are. Ben's in bad shape. He's in a medically induced coma, and the doctors don't think he's going to make it." Her voice cracked for a moment. "I lost it when I found out. Now I'm just numb. Shocked. Especially now that I know the truth about all this." "What's your wife's situation?" she asked after a pause. "She's badly burned," I replied, keeping my tone even. "That's all I know so far. I told the hospital it couldn't be her. She's supposed to be in Florida." Rachel chuckled again, though it sounded more like a sigh. "The hospital's calling me again. I got to take this. Let's stay in touch. Okay?" With that, she hung up. I saved her number immediately so my spam blocker wouldn't kick it to voicemail next time. Before I could gather my thoughts, another call came in. This time it was Megan's father, Frank. Seeing his name on the screen made my stomach twist. Frank and I had never liked each other, though we kept up a polite pretense for Megan's sake. "Yes," I answered curtly. "Mike," Frank said, his voice hesitant. "Yes, Frank," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. Pause hung heavy between us. Frank wasn't one to show vulnerability, so I knew this call had cost him something. "Have you heard from Megan?" he finally asked. I let the silence stretch. "Why would I? Isn't she upstairs in her old room, spending time with you, your other daughter, and that shrew you call a wife?" My words came out sharper than I intended. Frank sighed heavily. He knew I wasn't bluffing. "Mike," he started again, but this time his tone had shifted. It was clear he realized I knew far more than he'd expected. When I called the number, it connected me directly to the hospital admissions office. After I introduced myself, the clerk on the other end didn't waste any time delivering the news. Megan had been brought in with third-degree burns covering 80% of her body. On top of that, she'd suffered severe smoke inhalation, leaving her lungs damaged. Apparently, the fire had erupted suddenly in the drought-stricken area, fueled by high winds. It spread so quickly that it trapped the entire neighborhood, cutting off the only escape route. Over 100 homes had been completely destroyed. "Sorry," I said, keeping my voice steady. "That can't be my wife. She's in Jacksonville, Florida. You've got the wrong person." I hung up before the clerk could respond. But I knew better. As much as I wanted to deny it, deep down I could feel it. Megan was in Boulder. Still, I wasn't about to make this easy for anyone. I turned my attention back to her laptop. A few clicks brought me to Ben Turner's Facebook page. Megan had been bold enough to keep him on her friend list, so it wasn't hard to dig around. From there, I found his wife's profile. Her name was Rachel, and she'd made a public post from her family's home in San Diego. She was asking for prayers, explaining that her husband was in a Boulder hospital with severe burns. Time to get those prayers answered by a God of vengeance, I thought bitterly. I sent Rachel a direct message on Facebook, introducing myself and sharing what I'd pieced together. I made sure to include my phone number. A little while later, as I sipped the last of my coffee, my phone lit up with a missed call. I didn't recognize the number, but there was a voicemail. It was Rachel. I called her back right away. "Miss Turner," I asked when she picked up. "Is your first name really Rachel?" She let out a sigh. "Yes. Believe me, I knew what I was getting into when I married Ben. The name is just an icebreaker now. I did it for love." I wasn't sure how to respond, so I shifted gears. "You must be Megan's husband," she said, saving me the trouble. "That's right," I replied. "So, you knew about her when you and Ben got together?" "Of course," she said bluntly. "He's been acting strange lately, but I didn't know why until now. Everything makes sense." "Is that your story too?" "Sort of," I admitted. I knew about Ben from her past, but Megan wasn't acting any different, at least not in a way I noticed. "You're handling this pretty calmly," she said, sounding surprised. "How are you doing that?" "My phone keeps reminding me to breathe deeply and practice mindfulness," I said with a hint of sarcasm. "I don't even want to check what it thinks about my heart rate right now." Rachel chuckled softly. "You actually sound calmer than I feel," I said. "I'm not as together as I sound," she admitted. "I'm on pills, something my sister gave me. Ben's in bad shape. The doctors had to put him in a medically induced coma, and they don't think he's going to make it." Her voice wavered, and she paused to steady herself. "I lost it when I found out. Now I'm just numb. And learning the truth about all of this hasn't helped." "What's your wife's situation?" she asked after a moment. "Badly burned," I replied, keeping my tone even. "That's all I know. I told the hospital it couldn't be her, because, my wife is supposed to be in Florida." Rachel chuckled again, though this time it sounded tired. "Oh, the hospital's calling me back. I got to take this. Let's stay in touch. Okay?" With that, she hung up. I saved her number immediately so the spam blocker wouldn't send her calls to voicemail again. Before I could even put my phone down, it rang again. This time, it was Megan's father, Frank. I sighed. Of all the people I didn't want to deal with, Frank was at the top of the list. He and I had never liked each other, though we kept things civil for Megan's sake. "Yes," I answered curtly. "Mike," Frank said, his tone uncertain. "Yes, Frank," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. There was a long pause, and I could practically hear him weighing his words. Finally, he asked, "Have you heard from Megan?" I let the silence hang, knowing it would make him squirm. "Why would I?" I said slowly. "Isn't she upstairs in her old room, spending time with you, your other daughter, and that shrew of a wife of yours?" The line went quiet for a moment. When Frank finally spoke, his voice was heavy. "Mike," he began, trailing off as if trying to find the right words. But he didn't need to say anything more. We both knew the game was up. "Have you wondered why they did it?" Rachel asked, her voice thoughtful. "I suppose they thought they could cheat, have their fun, and get away with it," I replied, shrugging as if the explanation was obvious. "That makes it sound so simple," Rachel countered, her tone tinged with disbelief. "What more is there?" I asked, genuinely curious. Rachel sighed, her voice firm now. "Look, we've both got a lot to process, but let's stay in touch. Right now, we're probably the only two people who really understand how the other feels." "Fair enough," I said, leaning into some gallows humor. "But I've got important business to handle, like buying Bermuda shorts on Amazon for my cruise. Maybe I'll even throw in a Speedo because, hey, if you've got it, flaunt it." That earned a giggle from Rachel. "Well, at least you're making me laugh." Maybe the pills are doing their job. Oh, and get a cabin with a balcony. She giggled again before saying goodbye. I saved her number in my contacts, figuring I might need an ally in this bizarre situation. When I hung up, I noticed another voicemail. It was the hospital. I called them back and was connected to a nurse in Megan's room. "This is Nurse Young," she said. "I'm calling from the hospital's intensive care burn unit. Your wife is here. She's in a medically induced coma due to severe burns. She's right beside me now, and we were hoping the sound of your voice might help, even if she's not conscious." I hesitated. The way the hospital handled these calls seemed strange to me. Did they really think a coma patient could respond like this? "Why do you think that would help?" I asked, unable to hide my skepticism. The nurse explained, "I wasn't there when she was brought in, but one of my colleagues was. She said your wife grabbed her arm and wouldn't let go until she understood her message. Call my husband." Even in her condition, she refused to let anyone treat her until they promised to reach out to you. I couldn't help but think, way too little, way too late. Still, I asked, "What exactly am I supposed to say?" "Tell her what's in your heart," the nurse replied, her tone far too naive for the situation. Game on, I thought bitterly. Taking a deep breath, I spoke loudly into the phone. "Listen, you miserable cheating wife," I began, my voice shaking with anger. "I hope you die in pain and rot in hell with Ben, who's probably dying too. Just so you know, I'm going to use every penny of your life insurance to spoil Ben's wife, and I will never forgive you." The line went silent. Either the nurse hadn't been paying attention at first or she'd been too shocked to react immediately, but it didn't matter. I hung up, knowing full well that this outburst had ruined any chance of meeting my mindfulness goals for the day. Maybe one day I'd feel guilty for saying all that, but today wasn't that day. "Daddy, what does seduce mean?" Becky's small voice interrupted my thoughts. She stood in the doorway, clutching her teddy bear. "It means to lead someone astray," I said, trying to sound casual. Becky frowned, thinking it over seriously. "When's Mommy coming home?" That question hit me like a punch to the gut. What could I even say to her? The thought of explaining everything to my daughters only fueled my anger. For now, I decided to sidestep. "As soon as she can, Bex," I said, forcing a smile. She nodded and wandered back to the living room, plopping down in front of the TV. Watching her, I made up my mind. There was no way I was dragging my girls to Colorado to see their mother wrapped in bandages like a mummy. They didn't need that memory. I'd deal with their confusion and questions, but I'd shield them from that. Decision made. I spent the next 30 minutes booking a week-long trip to Disney World. I reserved a room at one of Mickey's on-site hotels, bought plane tickets, and arranged everything for us to leave the next morning. Ava would miss a little kindergarten, but so be it. We needed this. Just as I finished the bookings, my phone rang again. It was the hospital. When I answered, the nurse's voice was solemn. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Becker. Megan went into cardiac arrest. Despite our best efforts, we couldn't save her." I sat there, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of her words settle in. Megan was gone. Mike glanced at the clock. It was almost exactly the time he'd shouted at Megan over the phone. A dark thought crossed his mind. Maybe he should suggest to Rachel that she try yelling at Ben more. Who knows, maybe it would speed things along. Or maybe she just needed to be a little more passionate about it. Then again, he decided to let her figure that out on her own. Eventually, Mike had to send Megan's health insurance details to the hospital so they could process her death certificate and related paperwork. He called a local mortuary to arrange for her cremation. With her burns, he figured they might give him a discount, but no such luck, they still charged the full price. He asked them to FedEx her ashes after he and the girls returned from Disney. At Disney World, the girls were understandably sad that their mom wasn't with them. But with enough sugary treats and a princess makeover at the Bibbidi Bobbidi boutique, they managed to push through. Meanwhile, Ben held on until Thursday. Rachel didn't try yelling at him again, so maybe that gave him some extra time. She had returned to Colorado by then, staying with friends since her house had been lost in the fire. She told Mike she was trying to play the role of the noble widow for her kids' sake. Rachel hadn't told them about Megan, though. Her kids, being older, knew their father had been injured in the fire, making it harder to shield them from everything. Mike's daughters, on the other hand, were blissfully unaware of the situation, and he intended to keep it that way for now. The challenge, however, would be avoiding saying anything nasty about their mother in front of them. Shortly after they returned from Florida, a FedEx delivery guy showed up at the door with 2 packages requiring signatures. The first was a letter from his in-laws. The second was a box containing Megan's ashes. The letter politely asked if they could have Megan's remains to hold a memorial service and burial in her hometown in Florida. Assuming Mike didn't plan to organize anything locally, they must have been making calls to find out what happened. Notably absent from the letter was any apology for their part in covering for Megan's lies. That omission made Mike's next decision an easy one. He called a neighborhood teen to babysit and left the girls happily entertaining her with a full rundown of their Disney trip, complete with showing off all their souvenirs and photos on the iPad. Mike packed Megan's ashes in a bag, got in his car, and drove to a nearby national park. He hiked to one of the park's more rustic sections, where the bathrooms were little more than cinder-block latrines. Once there, he filmed himself dumping Megan's ashes into one of the latrines. Coincidentally, or maybe by fate, he needed to relieve himself, so he added that to the mix. On the hike back to his car, Mike thought briefly about whether he should look into therapy. But honestly, he didn't feel as angry anymore. Not angry enough to hit anyone, at least. Destroying reputations, though, that was another story. When he got home, he uploaded the video to Facebook, along with a detailed explanation of why he did it. Later, he wondered if the National Park Service might fine him for polluting the cesspool. If they did, he'd gladly pay. He never responded to his in-laws' letter, though he read in the paper that they'd held a celebration of life service for Megan in Jacksonville without him or the girls. When it came time to tell his daughters about their mom, he kept it simple. "Mommy had an accident while she was away, and she won't be coming back," he explained. They reacted as he expected, sad, confused, but resilient. Thankfully, their daycare and kindergarten teachers were incredible, offering the support the girls needed during such a tough time. The life insurance payout was a surprise. Megan had more coverage than Mike had realized, and the money made it easier to restructure his work life. He decided his daughters needed more fresh air, so he started taking them to playgrounds with plenty of other kids. These parks also happened to attract young, attractive mothers, many of whom were eager to lend a sympathetic ear once Mike allowed them to gently pull his tragic story from him. He left out the part about Megan's infidelity. Sympathetic was the goal, not pathetic. Soon, the girls were being invited to playdates, and the moms often brought along their pretty single friends. For the first time in a while, Mike began to see a way forward. He and Rachel Turner never ended up together, though they stayed in touch, chatting occasionally over the phone. Life, it seemed, was moving on.